Good evening, and thank you so much for joining the 4th Annual Chuck Hagel Forum in Global Leadership, hosted by the University of Nebraska at Omaha, again this year in partnership with the Atlantic Council. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. We're honored to work with the University of Nebraska to make these discussions possible, where leaders in public service come to discuss global challenges and possible solutions. The first Chuck Hagel Forum was hosted by the University of Nebraska at Omaha in 2019, and it was a conversation between Secretary Hagel and then former Vice President Joe Biden. He set the stage for the forum's focus on engagement on the global stage and said, quote, "It is our naked self-interest to stay engaged, not because we're the only country who can save the world, but because we can't do it alone," end quote. Now President Biden's words remain poignant to the world we find ourselves in today, watching with horror as Russia's war with Ukraine unfolds. The invasion and the swift and unprecedented international response have underscored the Atlantic Council's guiding principle that America is strongest on the world stage when acting in concert with allies. In the years since that inaugural forum, speakers have included former Secretary of State and now Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, and the first Secretary of Homeland Security, Tom Ridge. We're delighted this year to welcome back Secretary Chuck Hagel, who not only, as you all know, is a prominent senator from Nebraska for many years and Secretary of Defense, but he was also chairman of the Atlantic Council and serves still as distinguished statesman here. And we're happy to welcome him with Secretary Janet Napolitano, Dr. Jody Neathery-Castro, Dr. Joanne Lee, and Maeve Hemmer. It's an honor to host all of you, and we look forward to the enlightening conversation. I'm now going to turn the podium over, the virtual podium over, to Maeve Hemmer, Student Body President and Student Regent at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Maeve, the floor is yours.
Welcome. My name is Maeve Hemmer, and it is my honor as Student Body President to welcome you to the 4th Chuck Hagel Forum in Global Leadership. Like last year's event, the 2022 Forum was also designed to be virtual, and UNO is thrilled and honored to be able to welcome everyone in our wider viewing audience to be part of such an important event hosted by one of our most celebrated graduates. Secretary Chuck Hagel and Secretary Janet Napolitano, on behalf of the student body, I thank you for your decades of leadership in public service, for your commitment to our country, and for sharing your time with the Maverick community. This forum is the second series launched by Secretary Hagel in partnership with UNO. Its goal is to explore critical issues today's leaders are facing in search of solutions to today's global challenges. This event gives our UNO students the opportunity to engage with Secretary Hagel, global leaders, and policymakers. Our program will begin today with remarks from University of Nebraska at Omaha Chancellor Dr. Joanne Lee. Dr. Lee became UNO's 16th Chancellor and leader of our university in July 2021 following a national search, and is the first woman of color to serve as UNO Chancellor. As a first-generation student and native of Hong Kong, Dr. Lee has a passion for serving learners of all ages and all social, cultural, and economic backgrounds. Prior to assuming the role of UNO's Chancellor, Dr. Lee served as the Dean of the Florida International University College of Business in Miami, Florida from May 2017 to June 2021. Dr. Lee is a chartered financial analyst with areas of expertise that include corporate governance, executive compensation, investments, and international finance. Chancellor Lee will now give the official welcome and introduction of Secretary Chuck Hagel.
Thank you for the introduction, Maeve, and thank you to the students, faculty, staff, and members of the Omaha community for joining us for the 4th instance of this forum series. Thank you also to the organizers and supporters who have worked hard to make this virtual event possible. It is a rare occurrence when 2 former U.S. secretaries gather on the same stage to share their years of experience and wisdom. So I would like to thank again Secretary Hagel and Secretary Napolitano for making this yet another historic installment of this unique forum and a proud day for UNO. After all, Chuck Hagel embodies every quality of our Maverick spirit and what it means to truly be a Maverick, one who shows strength, entrepreneurialism, resilience, curiosity, and even a sense of restlessness. On behalf of all of us at UNO, Senator Hagel, we are all truly proud to count you as part of the Maverick family. A Nebraska native, Secretary Hagel graduated from the University of Nebraska at Omaha in 1971 after serving in the U.S. Army in Vietnam, where he received 2 Purple Hearts for his selfless service, among other honors. He would go on to serve most notably as a Nebraska U.S. Senator for 2 terms and later as U.S. Secretary of Defense under President Barack Obama. In addition to his ongoing dedication and support of UNO and his mission to serve the global community, he has since entrusted his alma mater with his archives, launched a leadership symposium for Omaha area high school students, and drawn a national spotlight to UNO through this forum, with previous guests that include former Secretary of State John Kerry and President Joe Biden. We at UNO are grateful to Secretary Hagel for embodying the Maverick spirit and sharing it with the world. I hope you enjoy that will be a powerful discussion on the global challenges our nation faces today between Secretary Napolitano and Secretary Hagel. Without further ado, Secretary Chuck Hagel.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction and for your leadership as well. We all appreciate, especially those of us who graduated from UNO many years ago, your leadership and your enthusiasm for doing the things that universities should do, are expected to do, and we appreciate that very much. To Ms. Hemmer, thank you for your leadership with the student body and what you do as a student regent for UNO and the state of Nebraska. And to Fred Kemp and the Atlantic Council. We are grateful for what you're doing again this year and hosting UNO's Global Leadership Lecture. And I'm especially pleased and proud of what Fred and his colleagues are doing here at the Atlantic Council, because as Fred noted, at one time I had the privilege of leading this organization along with Fred. So thanks to all of you. And one other thing, Jody Neathery-Castro is going to be the moderator, and I appreciate very much her role in this and her support over the years and help and leadership in keeping this lecture important as it is, but keeping it relevant to our times and to our issues. So Jody, thank you. Now, my introduction of my friend and very respected and esteemed Secretary Janet Napolitano. It's a privilege to recognize her and to introduce her. Most of you know that Janet Napolitano was Homeland Security Secretary in the first Obama administration. She is much admired by everyone in the area of security, of politics, of international leadership, which this forum is all about. Currently, Janet Napolitano is a professor at Berkeley University and director of the Center for Security in Politics. She never quits. Prior to that, she was president of the University of California, a huge, huge institution, which requires not only astute management, but the experience in dealing with situations that aren't always conceived and expected. But that's the job she had in the Obama administration. She was also governor of the state of Arizona, respected governor. She was Secretary of State of Arizona. She was U.S. Attorney for the District of Arizona. She graduated summa cum laude from Santa Barbara University, first female to graduate with that distinction. And it goes on and on and on, what she's accomplished and what she's done. And I couldn't be more proud of our speaker, our guest lecturer for this series, than Janet Napolitano. Recently, she just joined the board of trustees of RAND Corporation, which I also serve on that board. And that will be a huge, huge addition, and she will make a tremendous contribution to the board of trustees of RAND. So she's also, I might add, humble former secretary. And she never talks about herself. She always talks about the mission, what we need to do, how she can help. And I would end my introduction of Janet by saying this. She is the complete leader. And I mean by that, we've had, and we do have, fortunately, in this country, great leaders, inspiring leaders. But she possesses a special quality in her leadership. She's a personal and professional leader. She takes note of individuals who help, who aren't always recognized. She makes all of that fit in a very positive way. She takes the professional side of leadership in a way, just as I've noted in her past positions and accomplishments, seriously. And you blend those two, and I've always thought when you've got those two, the personal and the professional pieces, that's a real leader, a complete leader. So with that, I look forward to a little interaction here with Janet in a few minutes. But before we sit down and do that with Jody, I want to recognize again and especially thank Secretary Napolitano for doing this for all of us. So with that.
Well, thank you, Chuck. What an amazing introduction. And, one of the pleasures of my time in the Obama administration was serving with you in the cabinet. And now, of course, being able to join you on the board of RAND. And I want to thank the UNO community for having me today. And to welcoming me to Maverick Land, even if only virtually. Prior to February the 24th, what I was going to speak to you about was the need for U.S. Leadership in some emerging areas of security. Chief among these was the issue of climate change and security. The warming of the planet, of course, has many cascading impacts, water security, food security, the impact on migration, the impact on geopolitical stability, and the need for the world to come together and with intention and effort and sacrifice, meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, which are to hold the warming of the planet to 1.5 degrees centigrade, or at the very worst, 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. I was going to talk about that. I was going to talk about the security issues that arise from new and emergent technologies. How can we create some international rules of the road where cyber and cybersecurity are concerned? Where the protection of critical infrastructure from cyber attacks is manifest, where we have to deal with new aspects of cyber, such as the rise of AI and machine learning and the like, all of which create profound problems for the Department of Homeland Security, among other issues. And I was going to talk about the rise of misinformation and disinformation, particularly on social media, and how that affects, in particular, our democracy in the United States, and how do we move forward as a diverse and representative republic when there is so much misinformation and disinformation that is put out there on these large social media platforms and the like. That's what I was going to talk about. But I think what we need to talk about is the effect of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the impacts that will have on the world moving forward. You know, we've been living for the past decades really in the post Cold War world. And the Cold War, of course, was part of the post World War II world. We came out of World War II. The United States was the leading power in the world. A number of international institutions were created as a result of the war, including institutions like NATO, including the UN, and so forth. With the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the wall in 1989 and 1991, respectively, we've had decades of how do we, as a world, from a security perspective, move forward. And it was a relatively, I must say, peaceful time in terms of the great powers themselves. We were really dealing with the security issues implicated by terrorist and extremist groups, but we weren't necessarily fighting Russia. We were competing with China, but we weren't fighting with them. But now we turn to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which violates all of the kind of norms that we had been operating under. And while that fight is still kinetic, it's still going on, and we don't know the ultimate outcome, I think one outcome we can safely predict is that the world is now being reordered in fundamental ways. And the United States must take the leadership role in how that world, our world, is reordered. And that, I hope, is the subject of some of our conversation this morning. So thank you again for having me, and I'll turn it over to the moderator.
Thank you so much, Secretaries Hagel, Secretary Napolitano. It's great to have you both with us. At the University of Nebraska at Omaha, we developed the Chuck Hagel Forum in Global Leadership in collaboration with Secretary Hagel to give our students an opportunity to explore and engage critical issues with global leaders, like the two secretaries today, in search of solutions to today's global challenges. I'm Jody Neathery-Castro, a political science professor at Secretary Hagel's alma mater, University of Nebraska at Omaha. We're grateful so much to Fred Kemp and everyone here at the Atlantic Council for hosting us online. Normally, we would be hosting this forum in person at the beautiful Strauss Performing Arts Center on the campus in Omaha, Nebraska, alongside probably 200 or so students and community members, all joined together. The pandemic, unfortunately, has forced us, like many events, to be planned this year as a virtual event for the second year in a row to protect public health during this pandemic. And again, we're really grateful to the Atlantic Council for hosting us. So this kind of leads me right into my first question. Secretary Napolitano, in your 2019 book, How Safe Are We? Homeland Security Since 9/11, you mentioned and you warned that the magnitude of a pandemic could really be immense, and that it seemed like something off in the future at the time, and that the United States, you mentioned, was ill-prepared to face one, which seems quite prescient now as we are in the midst of year 2 of this pandemic. My first question is, in the 3 years since your book was published, have we learned anything? What have we learned? And are we doing enough to respond to the current pandemic, and about which preparation for global resilience for future pandemics?
Thanks very much. We have learned a lot during the COVID-19 pandemic. We've learned about the importance of public health to our collective safety and security. We've addressed problems that arise from how the United States is organized. What is the role of the federal government? What is the role of the states when we're dealing with a pandemic? And I think we need to recognize the weakness of the international system and the international organizations that ostensibly are here to deal with phenomena such as pandemics, like the World Health Organization. I think as we come out of COVID-19, it will behoove us to really look at the international organizations that deal with pandemic. It will behoove us to clarify the various roles between the federal government and the states, and it will behoove us to strengthen our public health system so that it is better able to cope with the next pandemic, because there will be a next pandemic.
Thank you so much. Secretary Hagel, did you want to comment a little bit at all on the sort of role maybe of working with our allies and global partners on aspects of both maybe prevention and resilience and coordination in the light of a global pandemic?
Well, what Janet has said is exactly right. And I say that in leading up to answering your question. The fact is, the world is interconnected. And there's very little that goes on in each country of the world, this country included, that is not touched in some way by this global interconnection. Certainly economically, our allies, security, I mean, everything. We're seeing that now. We saw it during the COVID. Supply chain problems. Pieces of an automobile, pieces of anything. A lot of those come from overseas. So I think that's the thing that we first have to recognize. And Janet mentioned that. As to your question to me, allies are critical here. Absolutely. I think I would say, Janet, right now what's going on in the world requires allies probably as no time since World War II.
I think that's right.
I know I may overstate that, but I don't think so. And it's going to get more and more complicated. It's not going to get less complicated. And in every way, economically, COVID, climate change, which Janet mentioned earlier, we're all in this together. And I think the more we can recognize that and help others recognize that in a way, and forge strong relationships and allies and alliances and partnerships. And we're forming those right now. Janet mentioned essentially a new world order being built right now. The post-World War II world order that lasted 75 years and accomplished a tremendous amount. No world war, no nuclear exchange, more people free, more people with opportunities and education. But we've got to realize and adjust to seeing what's going on, and then how do you manage this? And then how do you turn it in a way to the self-interest of all countries, but the interest of our allies, not just our country. And that's an important piece of this. And if we don't do that, then we're going to find a new world leader. And if America is not leading, I don't want my children or grandchildren to be growing up in a world where China or any other country is leading, because with all the mistakes we've made in the world over the years, and we have, that said, there's been no country in the history of mankind that's been as benevolent and judicious with its power than the United States has.
I always really appreciate, Secretary Hagel, your reminder to us of the we're all in it together spirit, and the importance of leading as the United States, not alone, but also in conjunction with our global partners. I think that gets me into sort of the second question here, which I received from some of the students at UNO. Several students sent questions to us, and I've combined a few of them, but this one is articulated by Kristen Davies, a senior at UNO, who asks, all eyes are on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as Secretary Napolitano mentioned. She points out Russia's intent to claim territory and power, which concerns her. And she asks, what leadership strategies do the US and our allies need to put forth in order to ensure that this kind of power politics, the human rights violations that we've been hearing about and seeing unfortunately unfold, do not become accepted or normalized?
Janet?
Well, I think the key thing we need to do is to protect Ukraine and to support them in their valiant efforts to retain their democracy, their territorial integrity, and to resist this invasion. And we need to do that in conjunction with our allies and partners. And then I believe, and this will take time and effort, but there needs to be some accountability here for those who participated in the brutality in the course of this invasion. And prosecutions for war crimes, I think, certainly should be on the table. And in so doing, we should strengthen those international organizations that carry out those kinds of measures of accountability. They haven't been all that successful to date, but I think, unfortunately, the conduct of this war will present that opportunity.
Well, I would just add, actually not add, but just reemphasize something that Janet just said. There's got to be accountability here for what's happened. We can't just at some point down the line as well, it's over, we'll make peace and we'll just all go on. Because we tried that in 1938 and 39, which led to the most devastating war in the history of man. And we're not going to be able to do that again, nor can we, because you can't advocate freedom and responsible governance and respect for all men and women around the world without accountability to what's happened. And I don't think we really have even scratched the surface on what we're going to find out about the atrocities. I mean, we know a lot, but there's a lot down there that we don't know yet, and it'll probably get worse. And so I know that's difficult, and when you think ahead, after we're through this, or at least this phase of it, and I recognize, as I said earlier, and Janet said the same thing, we're all interconnected, so we've got to put the world back together, economies, fuel, climate, and so on. But I don't think you can overlook what has happened and accountability for what's happened. It won't work unless if we walk away and not recognize that, it'll only get worse. China is looking at Taiwan. You've got North Korea looking at South Korea, Iran, who knows, South America. Everywhere in the world, every country is watching this and how we handle it with our allies. So I would just re-emphasize what Janet's already said.
Thank you. I'm a political scientist also, and so this may not be a completely fair question to ask you both, but it just kind of as a follow-up, do you have any thoughts about how you see this conflict ending, or what's next? I think for a lot of, especially I know with students, talked a lot with my students about, it's scary because this is, I don't know, visceral in a way that I think it hasn't always been. Conflict has been for. And partially because we're seeing these atrocities, sort of every day on our television screens. I just wondered if either of you wanted to comment a bit on expectations on where this ends.
I don't think we know. in terms of the actual kinetic battlefield. I would defer to my former colleague, the former Secretary of Defense, on that. But I do know this. I do know that the United States must play a leading role with our allies and partners in hanging together, in providing support to Ukraine, to President Zelensky. And this may require us to take even further risk with respect to Russia. We've been very careful to provide lots of arms, but not providing a provocation for President Putin to say, well, we have violated Russia's sovereignty and therefore he's entitled to attack one of the NATO countries and thereby trigger Article 5 of the NATO treaty. And all of a sudden, we're really in World War III. So, I think the goal should be to support Ukraine in protecting its own sovereignty, its democracy, its freedom, while at the same time not instigating a true world war. And if we are successful in that, other countries in the world are watching. As Chuck said, China is watching. Iran is watching. Countries in South America may be watching. And how we manage and lead through this conflict, through this war in Europe, will be very illustrative to them in terms of our expectations for the international order moving forward.
Well, I think Janet captured it well, and I agree with everything she said. When, how, and where this ends, as Janet said, we don't know. We can develop, as we are doing and have to do, different scenarios, because you always want to try and stay ahead of what's coming next, even though you're dealing with a world of instability, uncertainty, unpredictability, especially with Putin. So we've got to think through it all. What if, and be prepared as much as we can for that. But just my own reading of this after 8 weeks of this invasion, and where we are, or more importantly, where Russia is. They've got their victory parade coming up when May 8th to celebrate their military and their past victories over the Nazis in particular, and so on. And because Putin is in a corner in many ways because of what's happened the last 8 weeks, it hasn't gone at all the way he had thought it would go for a lot of reasons. He misjudged the West holding together and what we would do. He certainly misjudged the courage of the Ukrainians, misjudged, I think, the response generally, not all, of the world as these atrocities become clearer and clearer. And the fact is, most of the world knows that Ukraine represented no threat, and misinformation, disinformation, it's the Nazis, as he said, would take over Ukraine. We're going to go clean that up, and we'll relieve the good people of Ukraine of those terrible Nazis, which all we know were lies. So my guess is right now that he probably will, as he's already done, he's congratulated his military, and with his Secretary of Defense or Minister of Defense coming in and doing a big show in his office. You've all done brilliantly. We've got a victory, and so on and so on. He'll have to have something to use in that May 8th parade. Could this be one of the beginnings of a scenario that would end this thing with? It won't be that simple. Well, we achieved what we wanted to achieve. We've taken Mariupol, and we've taken some of that area in eastern Ukraine all the way down in the south to cut off the Black Sea exposure and ability for the Ukrainians to use it. I don't know whether he would go after Odessa. I mean, these are big questions, but we do know that when you look inside Russia, what's going on there, there are some problems for him. Obviously, the sanctions are having an effect. I wouldn't say they've strangled anything yet, but they're pretty heavy. We know through intelligence he's put under house arrest some of his top intelligence people, a couple of generals. It's your fault, not my fault, Putin says. He's been kind of all over the place. There may be an opportunity there to end something, but regardless of how it ends and where it ends and when it ends, something that Janet brought up, then what happens? Then what happens? In accountability and so on and so on and so on. And I think that question, then what happens, is something the United States has not been very good at over the years. I remember when I was in the Senate, Janet, I was on the Foreign Relations Committee, on the Intelligence Committee, and we would ask senior members of the administration, where are we going here with Iraq and Afghanistan? Is this nation building, or what are we doing after about 10 years? I mean, that wasn't the intent, we were told 10 years ago, as to why we're in Afghanistan and Iraq. So that question, then what happens, is an important question. We don't control much of that, but we do have some control over that, some control. And with President Biden's announcement yesterday of $800 million in additional equipment, in my opinion, that's essential, but we probably got started too late with this. The Ukrainian armed forces is not the same Ukrainian armed forces that we were dealing with in 2014. And I was Secretary of Defense at the time when the Russians took Crimea, Donbass, the little green men, not affiliated, Putin said, with us. We don't have anything to do with it. These are just good, patriotic Ukrainians. Their armed forces is totally different now. We, along with many NATO countries, have been training them for 8 years. And I think you've seen some proof of that, how well they have done with not the most sophisticated weapons. And the more weapons and the more sophisticated weapons we can get in there, the faster we can get in, is going to be critical. But in the end, like Janet said, we don't know. We don't know. But Putin is sending some early signals, I think, and my guess is that our intelligence people are picking this up, and we're probably piecing together some scenario here. But it's something that nobody can predict, but we have to be ready for everything.
Well said. Be ready for everything. No small task. You both referenced disinformation and misinformation, particularly talking about the messaging that Russians are getting and the messaging that sort of Russian nationalists are getting as well in Ukraine. And it's been interesting to see how even people who are under attack have been sort of parroting some of those narratives that the Russian government has put out. There are many news outlets and other sources of media in our own country that have even cast doubt on legitimacy of sovereignty of Ukraine, and in some cases are even unabashed in their regard for Putin's leadership style. David Ori, a junior at UNO, asks about how do we as citizens and as a government win the information battle? And I would throw that open to maybe not even just this particular scenario, but thinking about it in the context of our own country, because it's a really powerful, when you have the message and the media, it's a very powerful way to set agendas.
Well, for sure, and we've seen that in a way because Putin has been shutting down access to social media and to any kind of independent press, so that the residents of Russia are only getting what the state puts out, and that, of course, then gets reflected in the polling on the Russian support for the invasion and the like. And it's really in a way tragic to see those Russian talking points reflected in some of the statements by media in our own country, and some by some quite prominent media persons. And then the statements getting parroted within the United States. The difference is that we have a very vigorous, free, and independent media environment in the United States, so that accurate information is way more prevalent in the United States. And that in turn is reflected in our own polling, which shows great bipartisan support here for what the United States is doing and for the efforts and the leadership put forward by the Ukrainians and President Zelensky. But I do think as a country, we need to very carefully and thoroughly really think about how our media is interacting with our democracy. We saw, for example, the impact of social media that led to the insurrection of January the 6th. We've seen, and I saw as Secretary of Homeland Security, the increase in domestic extremism related to social media. Social media may not have been the precise cause. It may have been only a correlation, but it is a strong correlation. So what is the responsibility of the owners and operators of these large social media platforms? Do we rely on them to regulate themselves? Does the government take some action? Does Congress take some action, for example, by amending or limiting Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act, which gives them immunity from liability for the content on their platforms? And how do we develop and educate an audience that is empowered to kind of sift through the wheat from the chaff, to get accurate and recognize accurate information versus inaccurate information? I think these are fundamental questions for our own democracy.
Well, I agree. And as we all know, social media has changed the world, and it's still changing the world. And I don't think that we've managed that particularly well. It's a tough issue. I mean, it brings into play all the important dynamics of who we are as Americans: freedom of press, freedom of speech. I mean, you think about what is America, what does America represent? All of those interests come into play when we're talking about regulating social media. How do we do that? If we go too far or not far enough. And it's going to be more important as we go forward here. And we're learning a lot from the Ukrainian issue because of obviously we've known Putin is a master at disinformation, misinformation, deceit, lies. He's a KGB guy. I mean, he was molded and shaped in every way. And he governs that way, and he thinks that way. It's who he is. And he's not the only one across the world. And so what Janet's saying about we're going to have to really deal with this. And I think the Congress has to make this one of the priorities. And unfortunately, we're still fighting each other and divided politically and polarized. So these big issues facing our country, we can't get cooperation even to start hearings or start initiatives. And we're failing at that. I mean, the Congress isn't doing what it needs to do. And that issue is not the only issue. I mean, there are so many factors and issues that connect into this. But it really is, I think, one of the most important challenges facing our country. And I think it will continue to be a big, big challenge and an issue with this country.
Well, you've got several topics in there that I was going to ask about some of the student questions, so I really appreciate that. Secretary Hagel has been quite involved with our University of Nebraska Omaha Academic Research Center of Excellence, which is funded by the Department of Homeland Security, the National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education Center, or INSIGHT for short. And I referenced your book earlier, Secretary Napolitano, and a lot of your book chronicles the 2003 creation of the Department of Homeland Security in the wake of 9/11 terror attacks. And as secretary of this department, can you talk a little bit more about the DHS and sort of maybe, since your book, how you assess its structure and its continuing relevance with all of these important problems that you're discussing?
Well, you know, as you said, DHS was created in the wake of the attack of 9/11, and out of a sense, I think, in the Congress that A, they needed to do something, and B, that those attacks may have been successful in part due to different elements of the government not connecting the dots with each other. And so they put 22 different agencies of the federal government under one roof, added a few new ones, and called it the Department of Homeland Security. And, you know, the department, it has a wide variety of mission sets. It has the counterterrorism mission set. It has cybersecurity. It has border enforcement, air, land, and sea borders. It has disaster response and recovery. And those are just some of the major mission sets that the department has. So from just a management perspective, it is a challenge. And what we have seen happen is a lot of work going into bringing all of those various elements of the department together, managerially, process-wise, culturally. And I think we have been making great progress. The department was better after Tom Ridge was the first secretary. Then it became better under Michael Chertoff. Then it became better under me. I'll say, all humility aside. Then it became better under Jay Johnson. I think it took a pause in the Trump administration. There were lots of issues with the department, including they had something, I don't know, like 8 secretaries in 4 years. I mean, they were changing secretaries all the time. But now under Secretary Mayorkas. And so just from a management perspective, the department is a challenge. But I think it is proving to be not only a necessary department of the federal government, but serving the American people well. And I think properly supported and led, the department will prove to be as essential to the federal government as the creation of the Department of Defense was in 1947 after World War II. And in fact, the creation of DHS, Department of Homeland Security, was the largest reorganization of the federal government since the creation of the Department of Defense in 1947. And it took some decades for DOD to kind of come together and really assume its own identity. The Department of Homeland Security, of course, is only in its second decade. So we'll see what the future holds. But I do think the mission sets that the department has under its umbrella are critical to the future of the country.
Well, I think Janet has defined it very well. I was in the Senate at the time when we created it, and I voted for it. And I don't know if there were any, maybe one vote against it. I don't remember if there were any votes against it. But everything that Janet defined and said about why it was put together and what its major responsibilities are is right. I think some of us at the time questioned whether wrapping 22 different agencies up into one department was the right thing to do because different cultures, different dynamics. And I would say that Janet's former department probably is the most difficult department in the federal government to manage because of those interests. But I think Janet's right in what I've observed, and I worked with when I was in the Senate and the Secretary of Defense with different secretaries. Every time, other than I think the last 4 years, you have a new secretary, there's new thinking, new vision, new management, and it gets better. It gets better, it gets more coordinated. I think the culture is blending, and like Janet said, you know, this department is just very young. And I've often thought about what you said about the comparison to DOD. I mean, the fact is that Truman had to send General George Marshall over there to rescue it, to say, no, boys and girls, this is the way we do it. This is how we're going to do it. And it was difficult, and it was difficult for years after that, as you know. So, but it is now DHS is a critical part of our government for our country, the interest of our country, absolutely critical. And I think becomes more critical because of you got your fingers in so many pots. And I've always felt over the years, and I've said this, that I think DHS required more funding. And I mean, just one example, the Coast Guard. You have the Coast Guard.
Yep.
And I've always believed that they were underfunded. And I mean, just example, we don't have any new Coast Guard, any new icebreakers in the Coast Guard. The Chinese have state-of-the-art, the Russians are too, but that's a vital area of the world that we've got to really pay attention to for a lot of reasons, security, climate change, obviously, but we've got 2 broken down cutters. I was just at the Coast Guard Academy a month ago, by the way. So everything that's in the Department of Homeland Security is very relevant to our future and to our security and our progress.
Like the optimism, both of you as longtime government watchers and participants, this gets me into, I think, a question that I think is really important when I think about the mission of this particular series, Secretary Hagel, in terms of championing civic engagement and public service as a key part of leadership. This is designed to really bring those questions to the forefront and to really, I think, inspire students in so many of the missions that you've participated in, Secretary Hagel, on our campus and just in your work as an educator and as a leader. You've been a champion of civic engagement programs at UNO, like this event, and the high school student event that we do, the Chuck Hagel Symposium in Public Service. Secretary Napolitano, you have created funding for paid public service internships and fellowships at the University of California, and established, as was mentioned in your intro, the National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. So cynics, I think, a lot of times look at the younger generations today saying, that they don't understand things like sacrifice, and there's ways I think even in our national security and defense where maybe there's been a bit of a removal of that kind of immediacy that I know earlier generations experienced in times of global conflict. So how can we now cultivate a sense of value and obligation for public service and connecting with others in however we define our communities, and inspire our young people today?
Janet?
I'll take that. First of all, I now teach in the School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, and if there's one thing that gives me hope is seeing the next generation of students who, because they're in the School of Public Policy, have already indicated an interest in going into public service. And they really want to change the world and make the world a better place. And, they recognize that public service jobs don't pay as well as the private sector, et cetera. That's okay. They're willing to move on and to frankly acknowledge some of the challenges that our generation is leaving for them to deal with. And I would put climate change about at the top of that list in terms of a big challenge, which has been recognized for decades, and yet the world just simply can't address it with the sense of urgency that it requires. One thing that and Chuck, I'd be interested in your thinking about this. The actual practice of electoral politics has really changed. So I was running for office in the late 90s and the early 2000s as a Democrat in Arizona. Arizona was a much redder state then. So, to win, I had to, reach across the aisle. I had to talk to Democrats and Republicans and independents and explain to them why I was running and what I would do, for them if they honored me with electing me. There were some negative press attacks and things like that, but it was nowhere near the vitriol that we see in today's electoral politics. And one thing that does worry me is whether the letter of extreme partisanship and vitriol that we see in our electoral politics will discourage talented people who are committed to the future of their community, their state, their country, from themselves putting themselves forward for elected office. And Chuck, I'd be interested in your thoughts about that.
Thanks, Janet. First, let me just briefly address that section that you just talked about, what Janet's been doing and what I've been doing, encouraging young people, setting up different programs. One of the reasons, in my opinion, that, and we're not the only ones doing that. I mean, they're going on all over the world. And Jody, in your profession, and what Janet has been doing the last few years, is doing that too. It's encouraging and giving them, young people, opportunities with classes. This is an option I've got to take this class or do these things. But one of the most important, I think, consequences and outcomes of all of this, even if these young people don't stay in public policy in their lifetime or their career, what's important is to emphasize the responsibility that all citizens have, some responsibility. Everybody doesn't need to be governor or senator or mayor or in armed services, but every citizen has to be educated enough, and I think we've really failed at that in this country. I think because we've gotten so prosperous and so rich, and we've never had to sacrifice, and you alluded to that earlier, we're a generation that has been probably more privileged than any generation in the history of mankind, Americans, because we had no challenges really as a country. Now it's different. And so I think if we can imbue a certain responsibility in these young people, that's as important as any part of it. And then we'll get leaders too. I mean, real leaders. As to Janet's point and question kind of to me, as you know, Janet, I live in Arlington, right across the river, Washington. I stay in touch with a lot of younger members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans. I'm encouraged by a lot of these people. They're diverse in their philosophies, in their looks, in their skin colors, everything. But there's enough of them that believe what is going on now is wrong. That a number of them say we're better than this. So how do we fix this? Well, as you know, these are junior members. They've got very little control over anything. But they will, if they stay with it, they will have control. So I'm encouraged about that. I don't think, I mean, Gallup, and I'm associated with Gallup. My main office is at Gallup. I'm a senior advisor to the chairman of Gallup. They run a poll every year, and I think last 17 years, of the 15 most important institutions in this country, trust and confidence. Only the military gets over 50% of trust and confidence. They get it usually in the 70s. Every other, journalism, our judicial system, education system, organized religion, organized education, big business, small business. Many of those are down in the teens, in the low 20s. Well, when you got a society that has no confidence or trust in the very institutions that are responsible for really governing, administering, and its citizenship relying on those institutions, you got a lot of trouble. And politics, I've always said, Janet, politics just reflects society. Politics doesn't lead society, it reflects society. I mean, look at the Republicans, and I'm a Republican. I don't know what the Republican Party means or stands for anymore, but you analyze that just for a moment across the board. It's the threat in primaries that the right wing of the Republican Party is got enough power to say, if you step out of line or if you do something different or question, we'll beat you in a primary. Former President Trump is playing that game now all over the country. So I think the young politicians understand this. That's what we've got to break. And I think, quite frankly, what's going on in Ukraine and everything that we've talked about today is making people, not everybody, but you don't need everybody. I mean, we've always making them more serious about what's going on. We better start evaluating ourselves and our systems and getting along. You know, we haven't governed in this country for years. I mean, we can't even pass budgets. We haven't passed budget in years. We live on continuing resolutions. That's one of the most basic responsibilities we have in the Congress. So, I mean, you add all that up, and we talked about younger people that we teach, and I'm encouraged, like Janet, very encouraged by what I see and hear, and I know the reality of this business is tough, but I mean, that would be the way I'd answer the question. I mean, I rambled all over the place. I didn't give you a concise answer, but you know, that's part of my heritage as a senator. We do that.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, both of you for your words, and I think this is probably the perfect way to end this. I want to thank you both for giving us some hope and inspiring, I think, the students of today, and particularly on this public service question. I really appreciate that. I want to thank everyone who's worked behind the scenes to make this event possible, particularly here at the Atlantic Council hosting us, but also my colleagues at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, the wonderful colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy, your folks, Secretary Napolitano, and I want to wrap this up and say, be well, everyone.
Well, thanks, Janet.
Good to see you all.
You too. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.